Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this match in round 2 of the public sector debate competition. My name is Aniki Clark, and I'll be your host for this match. And we have a very exciting moot being debated this morning by the Ministry of Education and Youth and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And the moot is, be it resolved that on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good. What will they say? We'll hear in a few minutes, but at this point, I invite the teams to introduce themselves, starting with the proponent, the Ministry of Education and Youth.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Novelet McLean Francis, and I'm the reply speaker for the Ministry of Education and Youth.
Good morning, everyone. Crystal Williams, the second speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Karif Clark, first speaker.
Thank you very much, Team Ministry of Education and Youth, and I will now invite the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade to introduce themselves.
Hello, I am Brandon Crooks, first speaker.
Hello, my name is Anel Allen, second speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Clark Dawkins, third speaker.
Thank you very much, Team Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And as you know, our judging partners are the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, and I will now invite the judges to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Aniki. My name is Jermaine Barrett. I'm the Chief Adjudicator for this competition. And in this context, for this match, I will serve as the Chair Adjudicator.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rashana Jarrett, and I'll be one of your main judges this morning.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Carter, and I'm also one of the wing adjudicators today. All right.
Thank you, judges. Thank you, teams. And I will now turn over to Chief Adjudicator Jermaine Barrett to marshal the debate. Enjoy and best of luck, teams.
Thank you very much, Aniki. So, debaters, by now you are fairly experienced in the craft, but for our viewing audience who might be joining us for the first time, I'll go through the important rules. Speaking time. So the first speakers will get 7 minutes, the second speakers 6 minutes, then we will enter a period of what we call cross-questioning, where each team gets to ask the other team questions and the other team, the opponents, will respond, provide answers, and that will last on each team for 5 minutes, 5 minutes worth of questions, 5 minutes worth of answers, and vice versa. Then we conclude the debate with the reply speeches for 5 minutes. Importantly, there are 2 periods of protected times. The first and last minutes of the presentations for the first 2 speeches are protected from points of information. When you have spoken for 1 minute, you will hear an audible ding of a bell, right? And when you have 1 minute to go, you will hear another ding of the bell. Good. When you are out of the allotted time, you will hear 2 dings of the bell. And we give you 10 seconds to wrap up that final sentence. And so at the end of that 10 seconds, additionally, you will hear continuous dinging of the bell. All right, are there any questions, teams? All right, so at this time, I call on the first speaker from the Ministry of Education and Youth to open the debate. Hear, hear.
For decades, the Jamaican society has been under the grips of the inform of a dead culture. A culture that threatens the life of anyone who dares to be bold, who dares to be brave, who dares to speak out against injustice. Esteemed adjudicators, my opponents, and colleagues from the proposition team, and members of the audience, good morning. Mr. Speaker, the moot be it resolved that on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good, calls into question our individual and collective values ethical beliefs, morals, and where our loyalty lies, whether in personal gains or the advancement of a nation. Before I proceed, it is important to note that the views expressed henceforth are not necessarily those of the Ministry of Education and Youth, but careful research undertaken by the team. We acknowledge the very fact that to publicly debate this moot is not for the faint of heart, and there are many in the public sector who would rather have these back office or pillar conversations about corruption, injustice, and improper conduct. The very fact that as public officers we have spent hours deliberating the extent to which we cite examples and the details we provide in this debate is an indication of what we must confront when dealing with secrecy in the public sector. The culture of secrecy is so bad that even if someone speaks out, he may find himself as a one-man band. It is even our hope that by illustrating these harms, we do not become victims of systems of corruption that thrive on secrecy. Mr. Speaker, today we highlight goal number 2 of Vision 2030 Jamaica, which stipulate that the Jamaican society is secure, cohesive, and just. As the first speaker, I will be your Pablo Picasso and vividly paint how the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good through fear and 3 negative impacts of this toxic culture. The second speaker will continue on a similar trajectory, and our reply speaker will usher us into victory. My opponents, it is important to note and acknowledge that the moot itself blatantly declares that a culture of secrecy already exists in the public sector. So let me paint how the culture of secrecy is manifested and the attendant harms. 1, a squaddie turns a blind eye to his superior or colleague taking bribe from a motorist. What is the harm? The JDF is brought into disrepute. JCF, sorry. 2, an accountable officer fails to report that a minister has racked up an $8 million phone bill in a 1-year period. What is the harm? Splurging of public funds. 3, public officers fail to report that members of a House of Parliament are in breach of the Constitution by being a dual citizen of a non-Commonwealth country. What is the harm? Ineligible members of Parliament and blatant disrespect to the Constitution. 4, a TAJ officer failing to report a colleague who collects payment under the table while collecting revenues on behalf of the government. What is the harm, you may ask? Corruption. 5, public officers, including our first female Prime Minister, using the Secrecy Act in instances where it does not apply. The harm? Misappropriation of the Secrecy Act. 6, backlash from superiors if a junior staff were to ever criticize quality of work, even if the intention is to make improvements to the public sector. What is the harm? Stifling and suppressive work environments. 7, a police officer being suspended because he has voiced concerns on behalf of his colleagues about overtime payment. What is the harm? Public officers are being silenced. If we're not careful, Mr. Speaker, even independent media houses, not accessible at this time, even independent media houses reporting on public sector issues may be muzzled. Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that these are just a few of the plethora of harms. We're talking about a culture of secrecy. And when we talk about a culture of secrecy, we're talking about the underlying social meanings that shape the behaviors of people over time and practices that are widespread and upheld by groups. Mr. Speaker, certainly we commend the implementation of mechanisms, not at this time, such as the Access to Information Act and the Protected Disclosures or Whistleblowing Act. And we acknowledge that there are matters of national security that require high levels of confidentiality. But let us not confuse confidentiality with secrecy. The public sector is rife with secrecy and has certainly done more harm than good for citizens and the nation. Take on.
Okay, so you were talking about the human element. How do you actually address the human element in a culture of secrecy? Culture, by its definition, is defined by the people, not necessarily the institution or the state.
And as you have pointed out, humans make up cultures. So the humans, by their activities, participate in a culture and foster a culture of secrecy. I'll continue. Let us examine 4 ways in which fear fuels a culture of secrecy, and I will use Johnny as my scapegoat. 1, fear of being sidelined. Johnny fears being sidelined, or he hopes to be promoted, so he refuses to declare that public funds are being misused. 2, fear of victimization. Johnny does not report construction breaches because he doesn't want to end up like that environmental officer who was suspended for having reported that the CEO of a government entity has deviated from approved plans. In fact, as a public officer, Johnny does not want to be embarrassed by being escorted off the premises simply for doing his work. 3, fear of alienation. Johnny is a yes man and desires affirmation from others, so he turns a blind eye to reports being falsified. 4, fear of political fallout. Johnny's political party is in power, so he keeps his mouth shut as a public officer because he has been promised a position in government, in a government entity. Mr. Speaker, these practices that parade in the cloak of secrecy in the public sector are widespread and erode the social fabric of this nation. It would be remiss of me, Mr. Speaker, to close without pointing out 3 other harms resulting from the culture of secrecy. Firstly, the lack of transparency contributes to societal polarization as rumors and misinformation fill the void by secretive practices. Have we not seen that many of us in the Jamaican society are not Jamaicans, but rather PNP citizens and JLP citizens? Secondly, without public and internal scrutiny, inefficiencies and wasteful practices go unchecked, leading to the misuse of public resources. Are we not tired of getting reports from the Auditor General about the misuse and mismanagement of public resources, or are we satisfied with the fact that over $356 million of public funds have been spent on properties leased in Manchester that the government entity has not yet occupied? Finally, persistent secrecy breeds suspicion and cynicism among the public, reducing civic engagement and weakening the social contracts established for the government to act in the best interest of the nation. Have we not seen the declining voter turnout for general and local government elections? Mr. Speaker, let us ring the bell, because time come. Time come to end the culture of secrecy and the inform of the dead. Let us ring the bell as a signal that the culture of secrecy has indeed done more harm than good. My opponents, I implore you to take heed to sentiments expressed by Martin Luther King, who echoed, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal, and the ultimate tragedy is not that oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over the good people." Thank you.
We thank you very much for that speech. First proposition speaker from the Ministry of Education. We now call upon the first opposition speaker representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade to present their speech. Hear, hear.
Esteemed judges, worthy opponents, fellow teammates, members of the audience, good afternoon. The opposition strongly disagrees with the proposition's stance that, on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good. As the opposition's first speaker, I will prove to you that secrecy in Jamaica is legitimate, reasonable, and necessary in the functions of the public service. I will define the concept of secrecy, highlight that the idea of a culture of secrecy is really a reflection of the ever-evolving use of secrecy in the public sector, demonstrate how Jamaica's legislation and institutional structure uses the legitimate endeavor of secrecy, and illustrate the importance of secrecy in state institutions to effect more good than harm. The second speaker will elaborate on good governance and accountability, as well as the use of citizen engagement to promote national interests. Secrecy, according to the Black's Law Dictionary, refers to the withholding of information or knowledge from persons liable to misrepresent an act, transaction, or deed. The proposition may claim that there is a culture of secrecy, but I put it to you that in Jamaica, legitimate, necessary, and reasonable secrecy allows the country's public sector to function effectively.
Point of information.
Accepted.
So what do you say about the unnecessary secrecy, which is obviously widespread in the public sector?
That will be addressed shortly in the presentation.
I wait to hear.
We also thought it prudent to highlight the use of the term on balance in the moot, meaning that we must recognize that there are positives and negatives from both perspectives. In this regard, secrecy cannot be viewed as inherently bad or good, but must be viewed as vital and necessary to the public sector. Ladies and gentlemen, reasonable and necessary secrecy better positions the government for robust and timely action on state matters for the following reasons. Firstly, legitimate secrecy has not detracted from transparency in the public sector. Secondly, legislation such as the Access to Information and Data Protection Acts have been implemented to regulate the sharing and use of information. And thirdly, secrecy in the public sector ensures that all parties have been sufficiently informed while preserving the authority of the government in executing its functions. Secrecy in the public sector does not detract from transparency measures, but has in fact allowed for the necessary reforms to create greater openness. Secrecy as a legitimate, necessary, and reasonable endeavor is sanctioned and defined by Jamaican legislation to ensure that both the people and the government are privy to information about state matters. On this note,
Point of information.
accepted.
So what do you say about the secrecy that is not documented, but there is an unwritten code that prevails?
Well, that unwritten code, it's a product of the people, not the institution or the state. So the culture of secrecy, we're talking about the transition from excessive secrecy to reasonable and justified secrecy. On this note, it is important to observe that the use of secrecy is not unique to Jamaica. In fact, the present use of reasonable and necessary secrecy reflects the global recognition of ensuring that, despite the withholding of information, an element of openness and transparency is maintained to avoid misrepresentation. This remarkable phenomenon has been witnessed before. For example, the Dark Ages. This saw the decline in culture and innovation, but gave rise to the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period allowed the world to advance to unprecedented levels of technological development. It can therefore be argued that the use of secrecy in the past has given rise to the effective use of legitimate, reasonable, and necessary secrecy that is witnessed today. Ladies and gentlemen, in the more local context, when you consider Jamaica's history, you see where the use of secrecy has resulted in the implementation of legislation to further assert that secrecy in the public sector is vital. We are no strangers to the use of secrets to advance economic, social, and political goals. In fact, the Official Secrets Act of 1920 is still used today. The Act requires a signature by government workers before starting their duties to ensure that critical information about government operations are not disclosed to unauthorized persons. Since the Official Secrets Act, additional legislative provisions have been implemented to further build out the ability to use secrets in the context of the state. In this respect, there is the Access to Information Act of 2002, which grants the general right of access to official documents by public authorities, subject to exemptions when it comes to disclosing sensitive governmental, commercial, and personal information against the public's interest. Additionally, and more recently, there's also the Data Protection Act of 2020, which regulates how personal information of nationals is used and managed by the government entities. These acts came into existence to address the management of secrecy in the public service and, in fact, serve as regulators of information. Ladies and gentlemen, legitimate and necessary secrecy keeps all relevant parties sufficiently informed while preserving the authority of the government to manage the affairs of the people. It is for this reason that Benoit Puga, a French general and academic, emphasized that the right of the public to know does not trump the need of society to protect its citizenry from internal threats. Secrecy, then, is a responsibility of the state to, on balance, assess what information should be kept in secret to ensure successful outcomes in a legitimate, reasonable, and vital manner. On balance, legitimate, reasonable, and necessary secrecy affords greater benefit to the public service and the people of Jamaica. The fact is, there must be some level of secrecy in the public sector. In Jamaica, secrecy is a tool to creatively facilitate optimal performance in government processes. I have established that, on balance, secrecy should be considered from a holistic perspective, assessing both the good and the bad that has occurred in the public sector. Additionally, it is seen where legitimate, reasonable, and vital secrecy has resulted in a regulatory framework that has been created through the Access to Information and Data Protection Acts. Furthermore, I have demonstrated that the regulation of information in the best interest of the people remains at the forefront of the government and the operations of the public sector. In this regard, it must be understood that legitimate, necessary, and reasonable secrecy in the public sector has, on balance, provided more advantageous deliverables for Jamaican nationals. I leave it to my second speaker, who will expound in more practical ways how the culture of legitimate, reasonable, and necessary secrecy allows for effective governance, protecting economic stability, and ensuring the well-being of citizens. Laying this foundation, I rest my case.
We thank the first opposition speaker for laying out his case. We now call upon the second proposition speaker to do likewise. Hear, hear.
Distinguished judges, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The culture of secrecy in public sectors is not unique to Jamaica, but I will further illustrate from our local context how this culture does more harm than good. The Dark Ages, my opponents, really? You could not find anything other than secrecy being vital in our own public sector, in legislation and development of legislation, kind of like when our own government made the proposal to increase from 20 to 70 years that cabinet documents be barred from public access. Okay. The Secrets Act is not only outdated, but it is often misappropriated and abused to benefit unscrupulous and self-serving agendas within the public sector. In fact, the Access to Information Act of 2002 was established to counter the misuse of the Secrets Act, and it was enacted to yield transparency and government accountability. Firstly, the culture of secrecy fuels the perception of corruption. When the people do not know until story come to bump, it leads to widespread speculation and mistrust in the government. In 2006, a dark cloud hovered over the government as it was revealed that the firm which traded for Jamaica oil on the gold bond market had secretly donated $31 million to the governing party. This Trafigura scandal resulted in widespread speculation of bribery and under-the-table backdoor deals. What is the harm? It worsens the global corruption index, perception index, which currently stands at a woeful 44 points. Consequently, this may affect international trade, as I'm sure you're aware, which results in economic instability. And it feeds into conspiracy theories of the government system, which exacerbates a lack of trust in government. Secondly, the secrecy in the public sector impedes public participation in national decision-making. The public consultations on Jamaica's constitutional reform have lacked adequate engagement and disclosures. Many Jamaicans are still uninformed about the issues surrounding replacing the British monarchy with a president as our head of state. Chief amongst these is the vote, a secret vote by Parliament to select our president. Why should we be kept in the dark on matters concerning our president? The 63 MPs are selected or elected by us to act on our behalf and to make decisions that will benefit us. So why then should their votes be held secret from the people they are representing? Citizens will become disinterested in voting in referendums, elections, and other matters of national importance. This may prevent the desired changes we want in our constitution if these quotas are not met. The lack of transparency will also affect governing parties of being re-elected, as voter apathy will increase. Thirdly, the culture of secrecy hinders the management of the education system. The culture of secrecy in the teaching service is evident as annually hundreds of teachers migrate and abandon their posts without giving proper notice or any notice to the system. The harm is in the untimely but necessary adjustments that have to be made to address this abrupt challenge. Shortage of teachers in critical subject areas, the recruitment of unqualified teachers last minute, overcrowded classrooms resulting in overworked teachers, and most importantly, our quality of education will be compromised.
Point of information.
Go ahead.
How are those factors as a direct result of the culture of secrecy in the public sector?
Well, my opponent in the ministry and in the teaching service, which is a part of the public sector, teachers are required by their contracts to give 30 days at least notice that they will be abandoning their post or resigning. So when there is a collective secrecy of 1,500 teachers, September morning, resigning, it puts the education system into a crisis. That is over 10% of the total teaching population, 1,500 last year, September. I continue. The lack of transparency in the public sector threatens public safety and security, and it obstructs the proper oversight of public institutions. Since 2015, the human rights watchdog, Jamaicans for Justice, have made several attempts under the Access to Information Act to ascertain the circumstances surrounding the deadly fire which killed 7 wards of the state at the Armadale Correctional Facility for Girls. 10 years later, it was reported that a number of public sector entities, including the Ministry of Justice, the JCF, withheld and redacted information upon these ATI requests by the GFJ. The harm? To this day, justice has not been served. No one has been held liable, and the public does not know the circumstances surrounding the protest of these wards of the state. just mere days before the fiery incident. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the proposition has irrefutably illustrated the harmful effects of the rampant culture of secrecy in the public sector. By the very phrasing of the moot, it is established, and we agree that there are few benefits that arise from keeping certain information sensitive and out of the public domain. However, these harms far outweigh any possible benefits. In fact, this deeply enshrined culture of secrecy, 1, furthers the perception of corruption, hinders government accountability and the proper oversight of public bodies and institutions. 3, it threatens public safety and security. 4, it impedes public participation in national decision-making, which is a threat to our democracy. 5, it prevents proper management of the education system, compromising quality education. And lastly, the secrecy culture instills fear within, and it promotes the victimization of the very public sector employees, which keeps the wheels turning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Second speaker from the team proposition representing the Ministry of Education and Youth. We now call upon the second speaker from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, team opposition. Let's make that speaker welcome. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges and esteemed audience, good afternoon. I stand before you today to continue the argument against the motion, be it resolved that on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good. My first speaker has already defined the concept of secrecy and demonstrated how Jamaica's legislation and institutional structure uses the legitimate endeavor of secrecy to effect more good than harm. I will now reinforce these points and elaborate on how legitimate and reasonable secrecy has promoted effective governance, economic stability, and citizen well-being in Jamaica. To oppose the motion effectively, we must embrace the meaning of unbalance. This phrase acknowledges that there are both positive and negative aspects of any phenomenon. However, when weighed together, the positive outcomes of secrecy in the Jamaican public sector outweigh the negatives. So let's put on our scales of justice and weigh these factors, shall we? Firstly, reasonable and necessary secrecy is fundamental to effective governance. The public sector often deals with complex and sensitive matters that require discretion. For instance, the development and implementation of Jamaica's national security policy involved confidential strategic planning and stakeholder consultation.
Point of information.
Accepted.
How do you address the unreasonable or illegitimate use of secrecy? Because you have been harping on the legitimate aspect. So
Okay.
could you say?
So your second speaker highlighted that the Access to Information Act was brought in to counter the lack of transparency and accountability in the public sector, and so that is the fundamental base of our argument, sir. Thank you for that question, though. So maintaining secrecy in these discussions was crucial to prevent sensitive information from being exploited by criminal elements and to ensure that the measures taken would be effective in addressing national security threats. Secrecy is also vital for ensuring public safety and well-being. Counterterrorism operations and efforts to combat organized crime in Jamaica rely on secrecy and classified information to prevent threats and protect lives. The confidentiality of these operations is paramount. Without it, missions could be compromised, endangering the safety and security of Jamaican citizens. You don't want the villains to know your secret identity. Ladies and gentlemen, in the realm of economic stability, secrecy, not accepted, has played a crucial role. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, Jamaica faced significant economic challenges, including high debt levels and low growth. The government's confidential negotiations with the International Monetary Fund were essential to prevent market speculation and panic. These negotiations led to successful agreements such as the standby arrangement in 2010 and the extended fund facility in 2013, which helped stabilize Jamaica's economy. The confidentiality maintained during these discussions ensured that necessary but potentially unpopular reforms could be implemented effectively. Now let's broaden our horizon to the realm of diplomacy and international relations, in which secrecy is often crucial. Consider the historic negotiations between Jamaica and other nations on critical issues like climate change and trade agreements. These discussions often require a level of confidentiality to ensure that candid negotiations can take place without external pressure or premature leaks which could undermine Jamaica's bargaining positions. For instance, during the negotiations for the Caribbean Basin Initiative, sensitive discussions were crucial to securing favorable terms for Jamaica. This confidentiality allowed Jamaica to negotiate effectively, safeguarding our interests while building stronger international partnerships.
Point of information.
So while, yes,
What is the difference between confidentiality and secrecy?
but they're not mutually exclusive. Confidentiality is an agency of secrecy, so they cannot exist without each other.
So they are related, but how do you distinguish?
It is up to the institution to make that necessary distinction, but it's often a nuanced matter, which is why it has done more good than harm. So while our diplomats may keep a few secrets, it's all a part of the diplomatic balancing act. Moreover, Jamaica has institutions that
Point
promote
of information.
that promote transparency and accountability, which counterbalance any negative effects of secrecy. The Auditor General's Department, internal units within ministries, Integrity Commission, and Public Administration Appropriations Committee play pivotal roles in ensuring government accountability. These institutions conduct audits, investigations, and reviews to ensure that public resources are used efficiently and ethically. Additionally, mechanisms such as public consultations and town hall meetings facilitate citizen engagement in governance. These platforms allow citizens to voice their concerns and contribute to policy making, countering any arguments that a supposed culture of secrecy reduces citizen engagement. The Access to Information Act further demonstrates its balance by promoting transparency and accountability while allowing exemptions for information that, if disclosed, could jeopardize national security, international relations, or personal privacy. In conclusion, the notion of a pervasive culture of secrecy in Jamaica is not reflective of our culture or our public sector. Instead, what we observe is a balance between excessive secrecy, which has spurred greater transparency, and reasonable and necessary secrecy, which is indispensable for effective governance, economic stability, and public safety. Our institutions and mechanisms for promoting transparency and accountability ensure that, on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more good than harm. Therefore, we argue that the culture of secrecy in the Jamaican public sector, when weighed comprehensively, has done indeed more good than harm. Thank you.
We thank you, second speaker from Team Opposition. We're now at an exciting point in our debate, the cross-question section. We're going to invite first the opposition team, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, to ask within 5 minutes questions of the proposition team. And just to note, your questions are limited to 20 seconds. The responses should not exceed 45 seconds.
How do you address the potential risks to national security and public safety that might arise from increased transparency?
That is a wonderful question, and the point is we have conceded the necessity of that limited amount of secrecy.
In addition, we believe that you have conflated the terms secrecy and transparency, where confidentiality is important, and we have already conceded for national development and security matters, confidentiality is important. We have argued, though, that secrecy in the public sector has escaped the public sector to national practices, and these have done more harm than good to the society.
And despite this concession of the need for the culture of secrecy in national security, let's us not forget the 2010 Tivoli Gardens incursion, which, despite the secrecy of our then Prime Minister, there were over 70 persons who were murdered in the quest for a single man.
So you can ask another question, Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Confidentiality, by its very nature, it's a secret. That's known. So how do you address the concern that transparency, because you mentioned confidentiality and so on in comparison to transparency, how do you address that concern that it might lead to populism and short-termism in public policy?
Could you clarify our opponent? What do you, short-termism in what? Could you ask it again?
Meaning, transparency might, at one particular moment in time, in terms of giving information, you gave the transparency argument. If you're giving a set amount of information, you want to free the floodgates, let all the information be known, regardless of the fact that the government needs to reserve certain elements to enact future decisions. How do you address that, giving this information in the short term? How
Okay,
would it
thank
benefit
you.
the-
Thank you.
I think such a decision should be left with the people who decide what they take and what they do not take. It is not for the government to decide who they educate about a certain matter relating to the public's interest. The people should be aware of the implications and to make critical decisions regarding a decision that the government has taken or a stance that the government has taken.
Additionally, again, I point you to our concession that we recognize that for national safety, diplomatic matters, international relations, confidentiality is necessary. So please observe our concession.
And confidentiality is the protection of data, not resulting from a culture of secrecy or hiding information.
And confidentiality allows for information to be shared with authorized personnel.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that deserves a round of applause. Very well done. Oh, not yet done. Sorry. You may proceed. You may continue. You get back the time for my interruptions. Go ahead.
I have a question. So you admitted that the ATI was, your second speaker admitted that the ATI was introduced to counter the misuse of the Secrets Act to foster transparency. So then why is your argument based around all these not so transparent actions that still exist in the public sector, even though you recognize that this act was introduced to dispel that?
Okay, may I point you to several articles in the Gleaner, one as recent as April 2024, where Jamaican for Justice indicated, as my second speaker said, that despite exploring the Access to Information Act, they were not able to get any information. National Integrity Agency, they were not able. Dr. Trevor Monroe said they were still not able to get any information. GIS and all those people are speaking out against the challenges of the secrecy culture despite these mediating structures.
And these oversight bodies have had to take multiple public sector ministries to the ATI Appeals Tribunal for their appeals to be withheld.
But what evidence is that these occurrences are as a direct result of the culture of secrecy in the public sector? Emphasis on direct.
Oh, my dear opponent, if people are telling you explicitly that they are not getting the information, they are not able to protect human rights, and they are not able to do necessary things in the public interest, what other evidence do you need?
But what are the reasons why they can't get? Are these perhaps information that could jeopardize national security, IR, or personal privacy? You still have not made that direct.
Perpetuation of poverty, victimization, fear, trepidation, loss of lives, people, families that are demoralized, burdened, depressed. What more?
What more indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that excellent exchange of questions and answers. Give them a round of applause, please. All right, so we flip the arrangement now. We turn to the Ministry of Education. Putting 5 minutes on the clock, you may ask questions of your opponents, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade.
Okay, my opponents, how can citizens hold public officials accountable for their actions if and when they are not given access to critical information and decision-making processes and outcomes?
Can you please repeat that?
How can citizens hold public officials accountable for their actions if and when they're not given access to critical information about decision-making processes and outcomes?
The Access to Information Act, it delineates what information can be disclosed and what cannot be disclosed. There's also a tribunal for nationals to query whether additional information can be given. A culture has to be, it is legitimate and necessary in that it reflects the trust that's placed on the people to determine an administration to represent their best interests and to yield tangible outcomes.
By your stance on secrecy, are you promoting a colonial ideology of ignorance among the general population and the public sector?
You have to fit things for purpose. And if you're going to put it as colonialism and leave it at that without considering all the factors involved, remember we're talking on unbalance. Secrecy, we're talking about the evolution from excessive secrecy, which was damaging, to reasonable, justified, and necessary secrecy, which has effected so much good for Jamaica.
And also our stance is definitely not to take an ignorant masses approach where, in fact, the excessive secrecy has led to implementing the institution and legislation, in fact, to promote transparency and accountability. So that's definitely not our argument.
And it's why you actually have the Data Protection Act that was sent out in 2020.
So you have ignored the fact that we have said that despite these mediating structures, or despite guidelines in the acts, and so people are still not getting necessary information. And we have put to you the harm, but for some reason you are ignoring this.
Anything can be justified as vital, and so that is why we have to rely on the acts, the legislation that delineates particularly exactly what information can be withheld, and there is accountability mechanisms in place.
As
so
a follow-up, so can you show then, how do you counter when the information is not information that has been flagged not to be shared, yet it's not shared? How is that to be treated?
Well, I think that there may be occurrences where the information was not shared as a result of a culture of secrecy, but other factors, and which is why we've kept asking what does the proposition recognize that other factors come into play, and these are not actually a direct result of a culture of secrecy.
We acknowledge, for example, the concession in terms of the Auditor General, but would you agree that our reactive approach does not speak well to how we manage public funds? All the Auditor General reports come after the fact that public funds have been misused. Would you agree then that there are officers, public sector officers, who are aware of these ills and malpractices, who can declare these things so people can be held accountable?
Time. So you may respond.
Again, that...
No, but as in, can you repeat?
Can you clarify what is
yeah.
being exactly is being asked?
Yeah.
All right, so you remember now, you have 20 seconds to ask a question, you have 45 seconds to respond. Go ahead.
All right, so we're saying that the Auditor General reports are pretty much after the fact. They're very reactive in nature. There are public sector officers who know of these malpractices, who do not declare that malpractices are happening, and then no one is held accountable after the fact that the reports are published.
That does not directly relate to the culture of secrecy, because you don't have enough evidence to indicate that that's a result directly of secrecy. You're saying what if they know? You don't.
No, my opponents. Since here, the Auditor General has released a report that over $356 million have been spent on to lease properties for the tax administration of Jamaica. How can you say that nobody knew that this had happened before it got to the Auditor General?
You're assuming.
It's not an assumption, because these things have to be signed. Sorry.
Please respond.
You're assuming there's no evidence to support that they know and they're not telling you.
The Procurement Act speaks to accountable officers.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
But allow them to respond.
We responded. They're assuming. Yeah.
How do you...
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Another round of applause, please. Very well done. We now call upon, oh no, not just yet. We're going to pause for 1 minute to allow you to refresh yourselves and gather your thoughts ahead of the reply speeches. At the end of the 1 minute, we'll begin with the reply speaker on team opposition, that's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And then the final speaker you'll hear in the debate will be that from the Ministry of Education and Youth. Your 1 minute begins now. right, that caught you by surprise, didn't it? All right, so we are ready to hear from the reply speaker from Team Opposition. Again, that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. You may begin.
According to Cicella Buck, while all deception required secrecy, all secrecy is not meant to deceive. Esteemed adjudicators, opponents, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We have heard the proposition and we still remain unconvinced. Our team has strongly argued that when we weigh the benefits against the potential harms, reasonable and necessary secrecy in Jamaica's public sector has indeed done more good. My role is to reinforce the points that have been made by my colleagues and demonstrate how our arguments effectively dismantle the proposition stance. Firstly, we need to remember the principle of unbalance. This principle acknowledges that while there are both positive and negative aspects to secrecy, it is the overall net effect that matters. Our team has consistently shown that the positive outcomes of necessary secrecy, especially in areas critical to national security, economic stability, and effective governance, significantly outweigh the negatives. The first speaker has laid the critical foundation with respect to necessary and legitimate secrecy in the public service, dispelling the notion that there is a pervasive culture of secrecy. Reasonable, legitimate, and necessary secrecy allows for the country's public sector to function effectively and is not something that is unique to Jamaica. Across the globe, countries will employ measures to protect sensitive information, and it is our conviction that this approach is being taken purely in the interest of the public. Instances of excessive secrecy has resulted in the creation of mitigating systems to prevent recurrences, such as the Official Secrets Act of 1920, the Access to Information Act of 2002, and the Data Protection Act of 2020. It must once again be highlighted that the right to access government documents in an effort to promote transparency and accountability is limited to ensure that there is an effort to promote transparency and accountability. Sorry. Access to information, and that this access to information does not jeopardize national security, international relations, or personal privacy. My second speaker would have elaborated on the fact that necessary secrecy has played a crucial role in ensuring economic stability, where confidential discussions with the IMF during Jamaica's financial crises were vital in preventing market panic and ensuring economic stability. Excuse me. We also emphasized.
We'll stop the clock.
Oh,
Drink some water. We stop. Stop the clock.
okay, thank you. Sorry about that. We have also emphasized that counterterrorism operations and anti-corruption investigations rely heavily on secrecy, which serve to protect the integrity of their operations and the safety of our citizens. With reasonable secrecy, we have established that the government is able to create and implement comprehensive security strategies without compromising their effectiveness. Through reasonable secrecy, my opponents, the government has been able to ensure public safety through successful law enforcement operations by acting on confidential intelligence. My first and second speakers also would have identified clearly that there are measures in place, legislative and otherwise, that allow for access to information. So the proposition cannot, in any fairness, say that access to information is a challenge. Not when we have at least 3 pieces of legislation and at least 4 institutions that allow for access to information. It may be instead a lack of awareness that these institutions actually exist that is feeding the narrative of excessive secrecy. In contrast, the proposition's arguments often fall short when scrutinized under the lens of practical governance. They highlight the harms of secrecy without adequately addressing the indispensable benefits that it provides in key areas. In summary, our team has demonstrated that reasonable and necessary secrecy is not an impediment to transparency, but rather a crucial component of effective governance, economic stability, and public safety. We have shown that on balance, the culture of secrecy in Jamaica's public sector has definitely done more good than harm. I thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the reply speaker from Team Opposition, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. I now call upon the reply speaker from the proposition side, the Ministry of Education and Youth, to present their final contribution to the debate, or the team's final contribution, I should say.
You can tell me when to begin. Go
You may
ahead.
begin.
Honorable Speaker of this House and other distinguished adjudicators, my worthy opponents, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition has shown without any shadow of a doubt that by excluding or bracketing the necessary safeguards of confidentiality or absolutely critical instances of secrecy, such as national security, data protection, and bilateral negotiations, etc., that the remaining pervasive and debilitating culture of secrecy in Jamaica and other parts of the world has stifled national development, victimized workers, resulted in the loss of critical professionals, such as teachers, created an environment of fear and mistrust, muzzled the media, fostered rumors and conspiracy theories, increased public mistrust of our governance systems, sullied our national image, and created apathy, as evidenced by the low voter turnout in our recent local government elections, a failing grade of 29.8%. Ladies and gentlemen, tell the truth and shame the devil. Are these harms that we can live with? Due to the irrefutable harm caused by the secrecy culture, the opposition has failed miserably at presenting the net benefits of this modus operandi. We understand the opposition kept harping on justifiable or legitimate secrecy when the moot left it at a secrecy culture, but it was necessary for them to harp on this because they had no other straw to hold on to. Honorable adjudicators, a major part of the opposition's failure to build a convincing argument was their shaky and faulty premise. Primarily and critically, they have not necessarily distinguished between confidentiality and secrecy, a distinction already clearly made by our first speaker. They therefore use the barrage of confidentiality case arguments to support a secrecy culture. We necessarily reiterate the point that while confidentiality addresses non-disclosure of information in the best interest of the stakeholders involved, secrecy extends to the act of deliberately withholding any kind of information for whatever reason, often personal information that is aimed at shady actions and intents. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the opposition has failed to distinguish between a culture of secrecy and the specific acts of necessary secrecy. This is a critical aspect of the debate, since the concept of culture of secrecy, as earlier defined by the proposition, speaks to a widespread and entrenched predisposition to unnecessary secrecy practices. The opposition has spent most of its time over-dramatizing and overusing the few necessary aspects of secrecy that we have already conceded to. Cases, Mr. Speaker, that do not constitute a culture. And this was said by the Joint Committee of Parliament, that there are only a limited number of cases of information that should be withheld. So, and even if we accept the opposition's ill-defined concept of a culture of secrecy, its net benefits would pale against the sea of harms we have graphically described. The opposition also spoke of evolution of secrecy to justifiable from the Dark Ages. Must Jamaica wait centuries and eons to have the harms of our secrecy culture recede? As my colleagues have shown, this harmful culture has a domino effect on both the individual and society. I would add that the harms of the secrecy culture in the public sector have even spilled over into the wider society. Mr. Speaker, the proposition has also shown that the Official Secrets Act of 1920, cited by our colleagues, has been misappropriated, morphing into an all-encompassing weapon for silencing people and preventing necessary disclosures. The controls or mediating systems, while commendable on the part of our government, have failed. There is a plethora of evidence in our articles and news to show that these mediating structures have not worked. The halfway house of this mediation structure, juxtaposed beside the looming misappropriated Secrets Act, is potently harmful. And so we must heed the call of people like Jamaicans for Justice, National Integrity Action, and others to repeal this manipulated act and address the broader secrecy culture. Of significance, Mr. Speaker, as the first speaker alluded to, we were so fearful in debating this moot. We had to carefully select and modify our local examples, or I leave you to ponder what that would do. This is a crippling, stifling, and dangerous thing. Mr. Speaker, it definitely does more harm than good.
Thank you.
Let's keep the applause going. A spirited debate. Well done to both teams. Let me remind you of the moot and to remind the audience that this is a safe space. It is a space where ideas contend.
Absolutely.
And they are not necessarily our own.
Absolutely.
But that is the nature of debate.
Absolutely.
They were debating the moot. Be it resolved that on balance, the culture of secrecy in the public sector has done more harm than good. That's a task for the judges to decide whose arguments were more persuasive. And in another 10 or so minutes, they will come back with the decision. But well played, teams. And for those of you in the room, you can use the 10 minutes to refresh yourself next door. For those of you online, see you in 10 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, I begin with a reminder as to what this debate has been about. It's looking at what is termed the culture of secrecy that is pervasive within the public service and questioning whether or not it leads to more harms than goods. Of course, team proposition contends that there are innumerable harms, and they really outlined those harms quite clearly to us. Team opposition says, well, the secrecy, the culture of secrecy is necessary for the efficient and effective operations of the public service. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a brilliant contestation of arguments, and I think I want to hear a round of applause consistent with how good the debate was. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think we want to start by appreciating that in a debate we're talking about more harms than goods, more benefits than disadvantages. It concedes that, and the motion did say unbalanced, the moot did say unbalanced, so there's a necessary concession that there are some negative and positive impacts. Yes? What we wanted to understand, though, is whether or not the impacts are more disadvantageous if you're on side proposition, or more positive if you're on side opposition, not negating the existence of the alternative set of consequences or outcomes. Now, with that said, as the debate went on, we thought that it could have benefited from a bit more weighing of impacts. So what do I mean by that? When we hear, for example, that corruption is pervasive and that, people are minded to leave the public service, like teachers, for example, leaving the classroom and going overseas, and when we hear that voters are not inclined to turn up at the ballot box to cast their vote because of the lack of sort of confidence in the system at large, because of this culture of secrecy, we wanted to hear some weighing of that in terms of almost quantifying the extent to which these problems actually are significant problems attributable to the culture of secrecy. We felt that at times in the debate we were challenged to understand the extent to which these are just things being itemized, or the severity of the impact needed to have been appreciated. And we thought that that provided a good opportunity for team opposition to concede that, yes, some of these things are happening, but maybe it's not happening to the extent that team proposition would have us believe it's happening, or that certainly the huge amount of positive impacts from the culture of secrecy is so great as to overwhelm these disadvantages. We felt as well that possibly more could have been had in terms of articulating and proving to us that the enormous positive outcomes are sort of necessary and ultimately appropriate, given even to the extent that there are some harms that result. Final point I'll comment on before I give the result is this. The motion concedes and contemplates that there are some positive things that are being done to treat with the culture of secrecy. And so when we hear from team opposition, ideas like, for example, the ATI, the Access to Information Act, and other pieces of legislation that gives public access to information, we felt that those were very much appropriate and very commendable on the part of team opposition for highlighting those in trying to negate the litany of harms articulated by team proposition. But there's a nuance. The nuance is the way team proposition articulates that at an individual level, people are afraid, people are concerned about the risks to their jobs, to their lives even, and to their careers, if it is that having a knowledge of some impropriety, having knowledge of some inappropriate actions happening, that there may very well be consequences. And that is not treated with by the pieces of legislation that were pointed to by team opposition. And so it is in this particular context that the problem exists to a significant extent. We don't think that team opposition does enough to engage with that particular or these particular threats, unfortunately. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when all is said and done, one team pulls ahead with 285 points to the other team's 265 points, or 61 points. The winner of this match, the second round match in the public sector debate competition for 2024 is the Ministry of Education and Youth. Very well played. I want as well to invite my very energized and energetic audience to show some love for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, because they did very well. And so, ladies and gentlemen, who was the best debater in this match? The best debater comes to us from the winning team, and that speaker is the reply speaker. So congratulations to the Ministry of Education and Youth, and very well tried, very well played, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. Thank you.